You will very soon listen to a conversation between Monika Szewczyk, Anselm Franke, and Clémentine Deliss. And now I hand over to the panel, which will be slightly moderated by Monika Szewczyk, who's also a protagonist on the panel. Thank you.
Everything in moderation. I should repeat that because everything in moderation. Okay, that would be an ethic. I got an opportunity to introduce myself on the first day, and I think it works really well if we do our own introductions and make a brief statement with regard to the topic criticality and crisis. I just wanted to say maybe that I'm really excited to be sitting on the stage with the two of you. I've been admiring your projects for several years since I've known you, and I think that part of the success of this conference has actually been Vanessa and Nicolaus's ability to bring constellations of people together on stage that have been daunted slightly by the grand scope of the topics that we are meant to address, but somehow it gets to work well because I think the people on stage are in a constant conversation already, so it's a kind of extension of certain filialities or whatever you want to call them. I will turn it over to Clémentine Deliss. Maybe you can introduce yourself and get us going, because I think you've prepared a quite clear address to the topics, so it's a good place to start.
This is on, right. Good evening, good evening. It's great to be in Vienna. I don't come as often as I would like to, being half Viennese. At the moment I work in a city in Frankfurt. I work in Frankfurt, and I heard, having just arrived today, that everything's a bit too Frankfurt-centric, so forgive me. I hope that what I will say in this short statement that I prepared, that it will be applicable to situations in other parts of Europe. I think the art world doesn't like ubiquity, but it feels even more uncomfortable with incongruity, or it's always trying to get a grip around incongruity. And I want to present a few thoughts because I feel in many ways that I'm constantly dealing with this question of incongruity. And if we begin with a few issues, perhaps what I'd like to suggest, and I think it's pretty obvious, is that all around us we are dealing with sick, undernourished arts institutions and masses of museums with ailing historical collections that have fallen out of power. It's not just glossy new private collections, trendy auctioneers that we know, biennales ad infinitum, and shiny mega-scale private galleries. In Frankfurt, in particular, because of the status of Frankfurt, since the 900, it's been a city of trade. And after 5 years working in Frankfurt, I can tell you that every museum there is a trader. Each director runs a shop. I'm not talking about a museum shop, but there's a commodity that's being sold. And my question is, what is actually being traded today beyond the obvious populism? Access to foundations, very important with the coterie of the bourgeoisie in Frankfurt. Private galleries that pay for very elaborate productions that no museum can afford, or simply repetitious artworks, which is unfortunately the case with one exhibition at the moment at the MMK. And I ask myself, because often I find myself in front of groups of young curators, why do they want to trade within the same networks, in the same institutions, along the autobahn of a kind of contemporary art system, replicating strategies regardless of the fact that we are we'd like to think, an increased internationalism, which is certainly the case since '89, and in the last 10 years, you could argue, has become all the more internationalist. Why do we face the standardization in art production and its partner, curatorial practice? And which type of institution today enables productive criticality. What does it mean to be critical? And in Nicholas's and Vanessa's description of today's panel, what does it mean to run an institution, and to have the stewardship of an institution, and to try and forge an understanding of criticality? So the criticality in crisis that I would like to propose today relates to a very contested genre of museum with a collection that, in my opinion, signifies what Rancière would have called a few years back a radical uncertainty. It provides us, in a way, with an aggravated scenario, with an exaggerated case studies. It's accelerated, and I'm speaking of an ethnographic museum in 2015. It's a cultural institution. It has scientific pretensions. It had them anyway. And it epitomizes both inherent defeat, deep defeat in 2015, and an extraordinary urgency for remediation, a political urgency. To work, in comparison to a contemporary art museum, for the majority of you, it lies completely off the beaten track. Yeah, it's when you approach it, when you walk into one of these museums in Europe, you notice that it's raw, it's gaping, it's soiled, it's maculate, it's anachronistic, and you kind of recognize a sort of increasing deterioration of curatorial vision. So it's so grotesque that it might assume that it's not yours to deal with. Shove it under the carpet. Forget about it. Yeah? Forget about it in our period of a globally sensitive art world. Does that make sense? To work in this institution, it offers you absolutely no redemption. Yeah? If I work in an ethnographic museum like I have for the last 5 years, coming from contemporary art, it's clear that there's no way I can produce something that is free of criticality. In that sense, it means effectively dealing with a moribund group of custodians, a moribund idea of curatorial practice. And this is dying because there's actually no high-level alternative mediation of what is known by the experts who guard, in Germany, 5 million objects. I mean, I would gauge that the Völkerkunde Museum in Vienna has at least 500,000, if not much more. But 5 million objects in a city or in a country like Germany, which has the highest level of immigration in Europe, is extraordinary. Exhibitions in ethnographic museums, as most of you are absolutely aware, bear no interface with the criticality of curatorial discourse. They're produced like shop displays for global tourists, for working class consumers. There's a powerful class differentiation that takes place in the scenography around these exhibitions, and therefore they signify the continuity of the colonial emporium as a place of gloating. A place where you go to find out how other people sleep, make love, prepare food, build shelters, perform rituals, become part of a Männerbund, all within what James Clifford years ago called the ethnographic present. And these pan-European, existing former colonial museums with their collections of the world's art histories, for 1 minute, forget that they are controlled by an orthodoxy of ethnographic custodians. Ethnography, advanced anthropology, does not happen at the moment in the museum. It happens in the university. But imagine then that actually a small clique, much more orthodox than contemporary art, is holding on to the legitimation of 5 million objects in a country like Germany. I want to argue from my experience in Frankfurt over the last 5 years, as a curator who comes from contemporary art, not from anthropology, that these collections and their complex histories have phenomenal potential. Only in order to reactivate them, to remediate this situation, you have to take a critical, if not a militant stance. And the longer I work in the museum, the longer I find myself bouncing off walls practically. And that's why I invite artists to work in the museum. I invite lawyers, I invite writers, but initially I invite artists, because They act as conceptual, formal Spurensicherer in the real hardcore sense of the word. They're not there to be inspired, to take on another kind of formalist affinity. They're there because they can see and decode elements which are in these objects, which belong effectively, and I'll repeat it, to the art histories of the worlds today. There's nothing else. It's not about anthropology. So I think in face of the enormity of this condition, there's only one way to deal with a kind of criticality and crisis, and that's methodological experimentation. And, you know, just to give you a few points of context, I mentioned the 5 million objects. Let's think about the geopolitical hiatus. When you go and collect 500 objects from Papua New Guinea and another 2,000 from the Congo, why should young people today living in a city like a metropolis like Vienna or a city like Frankfurt or even Berlin be interested? How do you make a bridge? How do you create a connecting system, a metaphor, a language system, an optic, a perspective that will bridge the huge geopolitical differences between the way people moved during the colonial period and the way they're moving today? Then there's another thing. There's the wrath of anthropological bug chasing. Do you remember when HIV was declared as it came out of the center of Africa? And sure enough, to be possessed by another culture, to move into alterity via anthropology, is also to be possessed, and is also to take hold of things, to deal with possession in a very extreme way. And one of the most interesting things that is happening at the moment in these ethnographic museums is the case of biosecurity, of viral contamination. So if you take the Musée sorry if I keep going, but I need to place this in the room. If you look at a museum like the Musée du Quai Branly, on the facade you see artist-style exhibitions, Taschenbuch kind of versions of let's go and visit the Kanaken, yeah? Let's go and visit the greatest works from here or there. But did you know that the head of research, who is funded as much as the head of collections, is actually a zoonose? He's looking into the contamination process of epidemics that are propagated by animals. And effectively what's going on now is that objects are being prevented from circulation because of double toxicities. You can't touch the objects, all these art historical objects, because they're so full of poison. So you can't touch them because you would become contaminated, and if you touch them, you contaminate them. You break down the notion of conservation, and conservation in this case is 900 years, right? So the issue of restitution is another problem because it brings up a question of relic diplomacy. And very often the breeding of imaginaries, in contrast to the stockpiling of objects, is a refusal of change, a refusal of a kind of caput mortuum process, if you want to get a little bit alchemical, and a process which allows you then to start to use these objects to investigate other areas that are going on. For example, MRT scans to find out how an ethnographic object, a songye sculpture, might have an intestinal tract. All this is going on and no one is really interested. So what do we do? Well, I think we have to try and build synthetic alliances. I wonder how long and what it takes to find an institution where there is some kind of traction going on. I wonder about occupation. I wonder about the concept of a collection as a critical issue. I don't mean a collection that is produced, artists that producing works for collections, the kind of circularity that you sense. But I mean, what about all these dead collections that are all around, these cul-de-sac collections? Have you ever thought about a collection of armory that can't get revived? No one buys modern equipment today. How do you renew certain areas which were once incredibly important in terms of national identities? And I guess I think a lot about the idea of, could a landscape be a collection? Is that a collection? Is landscape, when you think of landscape art, are we already, if you look at landscape, is it a collection? Is it urban situation? We occupy an urban situation. Why is no one occupying collections? What does it take to make, to build, in a way, to avoid project art, to avoid this kind of building into the processual as if it was the only way that you could somehow be clean? Yeah? Why not head in for the maculate? Why not try and find the criticality that we're looking for in the darker areas, the things that are less pleasant? And in a post-colonial period, so-called, to face the ubiquity of websites, biennales, Skype interviews, blah, blah, blah. Young curators, many, many, many young curators that don't know where they're going to work. Then for me, the criticality in crisis is to consider which institutions today can be reformulated, occupied, regardless of, with precarity, I guess. So precarity would be the final word. Sorry for taking so long.
I think it's just right. Anselm?
Thanks. I'm gonna. I don't have such a concise statement here. I just want to share my, kind of a few thoughts on these two terms, criticality and crisis, and as a way of an entry into a discussion. I mean, first of all, maybe the way I see institutional work and its importance right now is really against the foil of a threat. So I tend to be leaning more towards a kind of organized pessimism, in the sense as an organizing principle of curatorial work, in the sense that, I think that the kind of enormous growth and professionalization in the art field that we are part of and that we've been witnessing, and financialization, etc., somehow is part of a kind of 90s becoming global of certain structures for which we don't have, like the most intelligent conceptual toolbox, I believe. This kind of climate was a climate of a kind of propagating possibility, and this has sort of a lot of these terms that come with possibility, breaking down boundaries, dialogue, kind of the cybernetic dream of globalized capital, somehow obscured in interesting ways our ability to say why something may not be possible, or the kind of haunting resurgence of a kind of multiplication of, on the one hand, of course, divisions, boundaries, etc., but also importantly so, what that means for a politics of representation, what that means for literacy in the sense of, a literacy of difference and cultural tools to negotiate complexity, ambiguity, alterity, and excuse me. Also, the kind of literacy of the visual and of a kind of, excuse the term, I don't have any better, borrowing it from Guattari, a kind of a-signifying semiotics, kind of a literacy that would not disclose itself to the literal as attached to linguistic consciousness, right? Consciousness, sorry. So the kind of space in which we are part of an expanding gesture of, the possible and the unspeakability of the impossible in that is a kind of predicament that I've been trying to deal with, and that I think is somehow an important task in my point of view for institutions to deal with, if they're not just committing themselves to this kind of implicit scripts of that ever-expanding professionalization, celebrity economy, etc. Criticality, I realized now that I actually don't know where the term originated clearly. If I'm not mistaken, I think what it means is a kind of positioning towards the project of critique that does no longer somehow accept the outside position, or at least tries to be reflexive, not merely reflective about what the inscription of the critical into the context of what it criticizes means. I like to think of it also in a terminology that Michael Tausig has suggested when he's trying, looking at kind of iconoclasm and political strategies insofar they are kind of implicated in a dialectics of power, and that becomes a question of representation and the visual. Insofar iconoclasm constitutes a kind of economy wherein the act of critique often ends up in a way backfiring so as not to take away power from the object of critique, but to add to it, like a kind of dialectical backlash. Now, this is an experience that I think, or this is a kind of thought that I find important for the kind of, looking at the fate of criticality or critique in our field as well, in the sense that, I'm still thinking of a more traditional, perhaps, notion of critique rather than criticality as really the task of delineating how one can put a set of parameters and tacit assumption, etc., rather than merely enacting them and judging something within their framework by putting these parameters themselves up for negotiation and what that means, right? And I think that our ability to put these parameters at negotiation up for negotiation is, I feel that this space is not actually expanding, right? That the possibility of that the space of possible options, the vocabulary we have, the kind of literacy that produces difference is actually not expanding. I'm trying to understand what may that have to do with art history, and recently came to think again about a lecture that Jeff Wall gave a while ago in Holland, Hermes lecture, where he spoke kind of, as a kind of gave a kind of grand narrative of sort of a dialectics of within the realm of the pictorial and depiction and anti-depiction of kind of modernism as evolving in that dialectics, where every negation within the parameters of depiction, anti-depiction would sort of somehow constitute a historical idea of progress, right? Like the negation becomes becomes the next standard in a way, kind of. And then he says, like, around the emergence of sort of the eye of the needle that was conceptual art was followed by this kind of expansion of the art field, right? And the interesting difference he makes here to other descriptions of this period of the expanding contemporary art field is that he says what happened in terms of genres is that everything that with this turn towards the kind of the situational and the performative, etc., somehow every other forms of art could have something that he called a second appearance. So, music, dance, theater, film, social work later. And basically the kind of strange condition of this like internet obsession, etc., right now seems to me a point where there's no bounds to that expansion, and that is not something that I criticize as such, right? It's just a process to observe and to try to introduce a critical distance again here means to observe what that means for the mimetic economy of critique. This is kind of a tradition that goes much further back to the origins of modernism, really, where kind of a kind of mimetic approximation towards a particular context, such as the dream world of capital or the commodity, could actually reveal and perhaps disarm something of that context, right? So Ekaterina Degot, in a recent lecture she gave at the Berlinale, in a kind of similar direction, mentioned Manet's Olympia as a kind of paradigmatic work for this kind of mimetic critique, right? And I think this mimetic critique is in a way, this tradition or this genealogy or this lineage is in a way exhausted, right? The kind of, in a way that, the many people who are not part of our circle, who are not sharing our vocabularies or so, rather than seeing us as criticizing neoliberalism, see us as a very symptom of it, right? This is an obvious reality that we all have to think about. And this kind of question of how one can introduce into this collapse of, where basically a mimetic difference is no longer disarming or seems simply to add to the power of what it pretends to critique. And even, in one context you sell it as critique, and the other you sell it as an affirmation, etc. This is a very real reality, almost kind of like a clinical patient. No? Art has become a kind of clinical patient in an intensive care, where sort of all the movements are under permanent observation, like a kind of brain dead patient. And only kind of the moment there is anything unexpected, anything that is not according to the script of those accepted scripts that are part of the professionalization scheme, kind of raise, like there's a signal. It's like almost a kind of in a similar way as kind of the administration of a kind of almost militarized economy of surveillance would perhaps work. So. This is sort of the background against which I'm just trying to understand what are the means that are, I'm struggling to find the right term for that. I'm recently been trying to, call this resources, like the kind of, the fact that, not resources in terms of money and other resources, but mental resources of kind of, that would allow us to actually step or even experience the limits of the imaginary and narrative space that we are inhabiting with this kind of system, that we are part of, and that's somehow how I would, try to describe the point of departure, really, for how I would try to frame projects or make particular themes part of a kind of debate in civil society.
I think what I've heard so far is a kind of consensus on the idea of art as a critical tool, art as a form of criticality, or art as a way to practice criticality, let's say. And I wanted to just pause a little bit and maybe share a quick anecdote about a group of artists that I met while working in Chicago, who call themselves Afrocobra, not to be confused with the cobra that's closer to us. But Afrocobra stands for the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists. So I like the insertion of bad in there, because we're at a conference about ethics, and ethics is somehow about doing things well, being good. Olaf, I know that probably is also too much about morality, but I'll just continue. So the Afrocobra artists got together in 1965 on the south side of Chicago in the basement of another collective, the AACM, which is a musical collective. So there was a lot of experiment with collectivization and with kind of producing a real work ethic around Black emancipation in America. And for 2 years, they refused for themselves to show anything. And instead, they got together and painted a lot, gave themselves tasks. They painted, there was also fashion involved, certain sculpture. And instead of showing what they were doing, they had critiques. They basically organized critiques amongst themselves in order to formulate what they wanted to do. And their task, which they assigned to themselves, was the production of a positive Black image. Because what they noticed, even in the Black arts movement, was that the reality of Black life in America, which the Black arts movement was trying to express, was not actually opening up the imagination to something that we might call a positive Black image. And they set themselves the task of producing that image somehow. And I think it's an interesting example because it sort of maybe cuts against the grain of how art works. Positive images are very often understood as propaganda. They're not understood as something that art should be doing exclusively, but they were obviously operating within a context and reacting to that context or producing their own context in a particular way. And I think this gets back a little bit to the discussion of the Moscow Biennial and what to do with that situation, which expects art in some way to be critical of the regime. Contemporary art is there to sort of show that it's still possible to have a critical space within what most of us are perceiving as a kind of totality, the return of a kind of total control. And I think it's interesting to just pause for a second and think why are we fixated on the idea of art as a form of criticality? Is that the crisis that we are confronted in the collections that you are actually shepherding with another complete idea of what art could be? And actually to treat those objects as the art of the world might also be something of a limit that we're setting for ourselves. And I ask this question because you're both at the helm of institutions that define themselves as Weltkulturen, right? As homes of world culture. So art is not quite yet in the picture there, and there's an opportunity maybe to use some other criteria to pressure our idea of art and to think about what it is that we are drawing as a boundary, and is it a good idea to invite artists to interpret collections which are not quite designated as art? Does that produce a kind of real impact on what can be considered art after the fact? I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll continue, but I just wanted you both to think about, maybe to help me think about that.
I like this idea of organized pessimism because I think it's important to think about moods. And when I think of criticality, I'm thrown back to somehow to the 80s, late 80s in London, where it was much easier to write for third text and sit on the edge and watch other people trip up and be eaten by lions. It was that kind of criticality that you still find at Goldsmiths, which combined with absence of funding leads to enormous passivity, extraordinary passivity on the part of a younger generation. I think the other thing that I'm interested in in what you said first was this, or I think Anselm said, I'm not quite sure, is this idea of practicing criticality. That's what I'm interested. I'm interested in the notion that you, to quote a slightly perverse word game of Paul Rabinow, the American anthropologist, I want to repair to labor. Yeah? I want to repair in the sense I want to remediate. I want to work with deficient situations, which are all around us anyway, but you need to qualify what is a deficient situation. And I want to find new forms of interpretation around this, which involves work. Now, this isn't, for example, some of you will have seen the heading of an event that's happening with A. Bronson at the showroom in London. It's not this, for me, slightly Victorian, neo-Calvinist, let's talk about something. This means, in some ways, a sit-in in a colonial museum. I can't understand why it hasn't happened yet. And when I talk to you about collections in the Weltkulturmuseum and all that, I'm not talking about some kind of flirting with artists who come and work in a museum and do they scratch the surface. I'm trying to create a counterforce to extremely insidious ethnicity politics, which use terms like indigeneity without chaos, that use terms like source community to define class-biased, education-biased access to things that are effectively here, and that, strangely enough, if there's one good poacher in the world, it's usually an artist, better poacher than a scientist. And I can't get my head around the fact that this material, in a situation like today, where we can do events all over the world, is just left under a condition of biosecurity, left in the hands of a group of worthy, intelligent people, but who still want to do exhibitions with this material, who want to create a multicultural agora, who are parapolitical. You can't tell me that the Humboldt Forum is not a parapolitical institution. And all this is going on, and everybody's fine to do a Berlin Biennale in the Dahlem Ethnography Museum. And nobody really cares because, you know, there'll be one artist who will do a bit with ethnographic collections, and then you'll carry on and find another location. And all the time I'm thinking to myself, well, what is about all this material? Whether you call it art historical, or you call it ethnographic, or you find new ways to talk about it, that's what I'm interested in. But it has to be practice-led. It has to mean you go into these cul-de-sac, you go into the dormant location. And the difference, interesting difference between the Weltkulturmuseum and the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin is a wonderfully important difference, because the Haus der Kulturen der Welt doesn't have a collection and comes from a post-war situation. It's rather like what would have been the Commonwealth Institute in London years back. The Weltkulturmuseum is one of 15 ethnographic museums in Germany. These don't exist. Neil MacGregor hoovered. Yeah, everything's been hoovered into major centralized museums. Belgium is another issue. All the old colonial countries. So there's something there between a discursive position that requires no connection to the stubbornness of these collections, and a situation where you have a collection where no discourse is being produced. And the question is, what do you do about it? That's all. That's, for me, a crisis.
I mean, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt is a late 80s institution that was kind of planted into the Kongresshalle, which really is post-war and a kind of, you know, symbol of liberal humanism as part of the Pax Americana frontier architecture next to the wall. In that sense, you know, it's a kind of, the institution itself is part of a history of the dealing in a catastrophic context, the question of difference, right? And sort of, you know, the architecture would be sort of the kind of United Nations moment of, all right, okay, there was this little disaster in the center of Europe, so let's be all family of man now. You know? But then, you know, as we all know, at the very same time, the Atlantic Charter promise of self-determination was again not redeemed, right? Could only be redeemed by another 20, 30, in the apartheid case, 94 histories of violence. Then there is this kind of, you know, the multicultural moment and setting of dealing with the question of difference and with what the background against which this question is posed, which is the history of colonialism. It's the history of kind of genocidal history, not merely the Holocaust, and it's a history of you know, what the racism, obviously. Right? Still, I think that these are questions that, you know, like the way the Haus der Kulturen der Welt then sort of dealt with these questions for quite a long time, sort of at one point got a bit deadlocked in national representation questions and this kind of, you know, the problem of a kind of flawed, false universality that, you know, would even, my preferred sort of example for this would be not so much anything the House has concretely done in the past, but world music or so. No? Like we all know there's something wrong with world music when it comes to discussing questions of political struggle and dealing with difference and the kind of conditions under which difference is accepted, framed, and dealt with. So what I've been trying to say... I don't
understand what you mean by that. Whoops, I don't understand what you mean. We all know there's something wrong with world music. Can you just expand on that a little bit? Because it's kind of, it's an interesting kind of, you know, imaginary consensus, but I don't know what you mean.
It's a kind of... in the very aesthetics of and sort of the wording, yeah? The aesthetics and the wording, two different registers though. It breathes false universalities. It almost carries already the index of a kind of non-political universality as, you know, a kind of something that is detached from the very history of modernity as a history, both of colonial subjugation or imperial subjugation and an emancipatory promise. Right? So, in world music, it's like parts of, you know, kind of relational ontologies or network theories today. They offer a false reconciliation. Right? I like to think of a counter model like Straub-Huillier's film Not Reconciled, right? My preferred way with dealing with the question of history in Germany, or the question of continuities and discontinuities. Always the question, when I said earlier critique, you know, the kind of question of parameters. What are the terms and conditions of the contract under which something is allowed? When there's a certain kind of ethnicized, you know, ethnic marketing is a term that could be associated with world music, etc. A kind of fashioned otherness that is inconsequential in terms of its ability to challenge the very terms and conditions under which underlie the dialogue, the exchange. No? The very words exchange, dialogue become ideological in the moment where they, in a certain way ideological, in the moment that they are detached from the ability to actually discuss the terms and conditions of sort of what for a diplomat would be sort of not what's on the table to negotiate, but, you know, the setting up of the table, right? So I think there is a kind of, it's a haunted field, right? This kind of false universalities, and today we are not quite even able always to identify them. I mean, because there's so much in technology. There's so much in this kind of ubiquitous mediality, in the kind of sphere of an expanded socialness that seems to be able to talk to everything, you know? So, but is not able to understand that it's actually extreme. That this space of literacy and alterity may in fact actually shrink. Right? Like so, what I was trying to suggest is that, you know, you need to understand in the background of such an institutional setting. Somehow organized pessimism would sort of always to confront the possibility, not always somehow getting hooked on it, because this, what I've been trying to delineate is kind of, connected to a real sort of a question of the fate of negativity and negation and what it meant in sort of for the long history of critique, right? This negativity and negation are no longer such great, like they kind of become essentialized. The partisan is channeled into identitarian schemes. Even queer people are now starting to, request from you that you identify yourself, etc. Like, you know what I mean? Sort of, this is like hardening a kind of strange kind of backlash of the identitarian, of logic of division, etc., into a field that seems to open with a kind of narrative of opening up, of expanding, etc. So this was what I was trying to refer to earlier. What it means in a place like the Haus der Kulturen to work there now for me is to kind of define, what kind of scripts, narratives, and cognitive schemes, or whatever word you want to give it, are determining the set of choices now that we have, and sort of always try to analyze them, including art, as kind of symptomatic of certain imaginaries, and with the kind of special attention that the alterity in our social imaginaries is not what we like. The kind of the problem that remediating, for example, an ethnographic object that stands for a certain, probably a difference that in some cases is rather radical, like, where the multicultural kind of settlement would be, it's an object anyway, right? The universality is sort of on the side of the object, etc. But this kind of, the cultural projections or the kind of symbolization processes, they are allowed to be kind of, a multitude, right? But that setting doesn't speak to the relations of power. So how can you work with narrative scripts and cognitive schemes to actually make them speak to the very possibility of the otherwise? That's a kind of a term that I also feel a bit strange about, but I guess that's where I would say, art is crucial, because the problem is that even in the field of art, the professionalization that we currently witness kind of closes down that, because the space of negativity is no longer quite what it was, certainly not romantically charged as it was still in the 60s and 70s. This space now is a kind of space basically of fear and abandonment, because people are just afraid not to be part of, right? Because in this outside, there's no romantic promise anymore. And the opposite side is a kind of radical negativity, which is this kind of neo-ideological kind of, an absolute enemy, right? And we all know that has also absolute devastating effects on the mental and psychic economies of people, and doesn't produce good art, right? So this is sort of the predicament, the field of predicament in which I think art is absolutely crucial, but it needs to be situated because the agency of curatorial framing itself has a certain reifying function. No? Like it affirms this kind of systemic parameters of, that this is what it is, but that kind of this is what it is, it's a kind of positivist function, no? Sort of, it pacifies very often what is actually unsettling in art. And I'm not speaking about, I'm definitely not speaking about just bringing struggles into the museum, because that is often so blind to that everything you bring into the museum or exhibition undergoes significant transformation and may absolutely harm the very struggle that, showing an image of a demonstration is sort of the baseline of kind of agitated stupidity in my eyes, yeah? Like, because the museum or the exhibition can work on the resources one has of how a struggle is fought and how it positions itself in a dialectics of power, and the kind of unsettling ability of images and artworks is always something that needs to be released and cultivated, and this is what museums can do. Right? There's a kind of clinical depression also on these questions, right? Somehow that become, rather than cultivating literacy that are able to deal with the unspeakable in the dialectics of power, what they do is a kind of strange literate identification of this space with struggles that take place in a completely different economy of signification, right? Where, once in certain struggles, you would like, a word or the ability to phrase something in a certain way, the power that this may have in as part of a particular struggle depends exactly on the resonance space that it's able to activate, on the kind of how, is it grounded in a kind of narrative structure that can put that what is sort of the positivist reality up for negotiation, right? And this is, I think, something that most kind of museums today are not giving me, at least, but a lot of art still is. So my question is much more about, what am I doing when I'm framing this as curator and as somebody who tries to kind of cultivate the institutional, not criticize it, but try to do what can be done with it.
Clémentine, would you agree with that formulation that museums are failing, but art is able to produce this kind of space? And maybe you could be quite specific about certain project that you've done.
Yeah, I can give an example. Definitely, I think just to come back to this difference, I think it's very interesting because Anselm hasn't been. It's not like there was a position for what he was doing at the Haus der Kultur in der Welt. I think, if I understand right, after having done shows there, I mean, there was always an exhibition space, but the relationship between the exhibition and the debates that go on in the Haus der Kultur in der Welt, the way you framed it is very new. So it's not a reifying dispositif of an exhibition, which is what you're trying to fight against. And it produces a visualization of debates in many ways. What I'm interested in is somehow it's this question of thinking as a physical act and the objects in a collection as unfinished. I'm interested in unfinished collections, unfinished situations. If you want to do a thesis on Tetra Pak, you'll find loads of people who have written about Tetra Pak. It's not exotic to say we don't know anything about this fish trap. We don't know anything about this object except that it says 1943 Angola fish fly mask. This absence, this orphaned, unauthored situation around these objects means that there is it's an incredibly political and, the word which we haven't used up till now, ethical situation. One example...
What do you mean by that, ethical?
Ethical in the sense that it's umstritten. It's there is what is the word? No, there is a lot of people clamoring, aiming to get the right to speak on behalf of these collections, and there are not many who are getting through because there is a politics of source community now. So the idea is. It's I'll explain it. So when I go to a meeting of the directors of ethnographic museums in German-speaking countries, they, not outrightly, but they will often say, why do you invite an artist and not somebody from the source community? So if I ask an artist like El Hadji Si, or a curator from Senegal, or a curator like Gabi Nkobo from South Africa, are you source community? Boom, immediately you realize that actually what the anthropologists are talking about is class and education. So there is a kind of permanent reflecting game going on. You remove the objects unauthored, because very important is that when these collections were created, you don't have time when you want to amass thousands of objects and bring them back to Europe in the colonial and period, and even in the 60s in Frankfurt. You don't have time to ask him, Anselm, where did you get those shoes? Who made those shoes? Where did you get this piece of strange sculpture in your room? Do you mind if I photograph it with you in front of it? Could you tell me who the artist is? How old is it? How old do you think an object is? What is the age of an object? Because you want to bring it back. And the moment that you start becoming too curious, whoa, all of a sudden, Anselm might say, well, hold on a minute, why should I give this interesting object away? He's just qualified it for me. He's engaged in a wonderful process of evaluation that I'm interested in. So this unauthored status of these objects is highly problematic, and the notion of a source community suggests that only someone who comes from, has an ethnic appartenance, an ethnic association directly with the object, with the culture that produced this object, that sleeps in a particular way, that eats in a particular, that believes in these cults, yeah, that etc., like we know from anthropology, they have the right to interpret Anselm's whatever, his ritual object. The moment that you bring in somebody, whether it's an artist from that culture, the source community game falls apart. And James Clifford, in his new book, Returns, talks about indigeneity and gives good examples of it, but he says it only works if it is fucked up with diaspora. In other words, you can't say, let's send all the Fijian works back to Fiji if the Fijian community is in London. And maybe I can give one example of the way we work with artists. Case of source community artist. He would laugh if he could hear this. This is Luke Willis Thompson. Luke Willis Thompson, who by chance, well, not by chance because he's a good artist, won the Walters Prize last year. And he came and he stayed in residency at the museum. And he picked up on a classic piece of ethical material, code of ethics, human remains. And it's a skull from New Britain that was collected in 1878. So it's an early piece for the collection in Frankfurt. And it's a skull that is modeled. So you have the skull and it's a dancer who wears it, and the dancer bites into a stick that is through the back of the head. So it's quite extreme, yeah? If you want to wear it, you wear the head of someone else on your own body. And after 3 weeks, Luke handed me a piece of paper and he said, I want to give the funding for my project to someone who's just died in Frankfurt. I want to restitute, not this skull in the sense of a relic diplomacy, symbolic gesture between two countries. I want to find someone who is in Frankfurt who has a problem and can't be buried. You know, Frankfurt, the most international city in Germany. Imagine the amount of people that pop it every day. Yeah, many, many people die in Frankfurt. We don't really hear about it. So these are subterranean trends. This is the global street under the radar, as Saskia Sassen would call it. And so the huge problem, very clever, that we had as a museum and that my curator for Africa dealt with, Yvette Mutumba, was how do we find an agent, a broker for the money that we want to give to somebody who will, in discretion, send a body back, a body today, back to whichever country. And that meant that the museum had to engage in a dialogue in the city, which was very personal, highly critiqued by the person in the end who took on so this kind of process is not something that could have emerged through a kind of normal anthropological discussion of ritual and burial amongst thee. Yeah? It doesn't work like that. And all the artists who have worked with us, the 30 in the last 5 years, and the way, Willem de Roy right now, who's dealing with feathers and Algerian camel hair, and who may be producing replicas, but as far as I'm concerned, he's in the heart of this pandemic question of, SARS and avian flu and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. So there are all these questions that can emerge out of an analysis of stubborn, frumpy objects that if you don't watch out, you'll never see again, because they will be contained, buried, they won't be sent back. The question of toxicity will become greater and greater. The possibility, the potential that there's DNA in these objects that can lead to an epidemic. Yeah? And it's very interesting to look at someone like Andrew Lakoff, who talks about viral laboratories. Like I read in the New York International Herald Tribune today that they've just killed 500,000 turkeys, big fat turkeys that you use to feed other birds, They've just killed them because they've come up with a new pandemic. They've killed 8 million pigs recently, and pigs in China are a big issue. Yeah? And in order to counteract these terrible viral tendencies, these pan-epidemics, they use a system of sentinels, scenarios, and stockpiling. And there are laboratories all over the world that can compare viral emergencies and emergence. This is not very different to the stockpiling of objects that are out of the market in a very perverse way, because 20 years ago, you could still, 30 years ago, when the global art world wasn't quite as global as easily as it is today, you could still go to Sotheby's or Christie's and you could watch an auctioneer holding up an object from Congo or and having it sold like that. It was rare. Today, nothing circulates. No museum is selling anything. In the 60s, everything was being swapped and traded. I was, if I was a director, I would swap with Munich or swap with Vienna. Höchst verboten. So the moment one of these objects with pedigree, Eurocentric pedigree, provenance, everything that is delicious to support the alterity of this material, the moment it goes onto the market, it's bought, usually from the Middle East. And there's something extraordinary about the stockpiling. The stockpiling, call it other people's art histories, call it their ethnography, I don't care. For me, it's a stockpiling of code, of intelligence that has to somehow be dealt with in the context of great talk about biennales and internationalism and all of this. And so I just bring it back not to some declarations of intent here, but the question is, what do you do? And right now, I'm interested in being restive. In other words, in not being super happy about going on there. I don't want to be a museum director for 15 years. So I'm interested in what it means to work on a precarious level with immaculate collections and to work out how conceptually, practically, and politically to exit the field. To say, okay, as a curator, I've worked in this area, now I've gone as far as I can. I've had a reactionary backlash. It's not going to change one thing to the Weltmuseum here. It's not going to change one thing to the Humboldt Forum. They will still make their weird exhibitions with their scenographers. So my question is then, because I'm not a museum anthropologist, is where do I go? What does it mean now to exit the field? Where is this criticality possible? Where do we work? What is the point of traction, the point of where things become difficult on every single level? Even in the way we have to talk about this. Where do I find myself incongruous? And for that, thankfully, art practice is fertile ground and always will be. Much more than academia, unfortunately. Much more.
Anselm, could you address a bit the way that we posit art practice as the answer to the impossibilities and the contradictions and the kinds of moral dilemmas and that we face within existing institutions, within existing states? There is a sense I'm getting that art becomes the kind of Trojan horse or a way to somehow occupy space, political space, cultural space, and there's a kind of default understanding or a default that art is this kind of tool. Is that how you understand art when you work with it in the Weltkulturellen Museum? And then we can maybe open it up to questions.
Default, I mean, I've also been doing...
I'm being a bit polemical because I need to...
I've also been doing biennales, so I know what you talk about, no? Like, for me, the question is not so much... I mean, this kind of generalizations I avoid. I'm all up for other dangerous generalizations too often, but I think that I'm not trying to judge, the default mode when it comes to an artistic practice too quick, but I'm judging it quickly when it comes to framing, institutional, political, curatorial, etc. I'm not saying in general art, but obviously there is a kind of, we're working in a historical lineage that produced this, you may rightfully say, illusion of a substance, or you can also say at the same time, and I would do that, like at the same time, a space, right, in which there's a permanent possibility of disturbance, a renegotiation, a kind of pulling the carpet of certainties, of scripts, and etc., which concerns the kind of testing ground of attitudes, positions, modes of being, right? This is what and this testing ground needs to be protected because it's a space of where one can access cultural resources and resources that are used for becoming conscious and kind of well equipped in facing one's inscription into historical context, political situations, and the complicity question, etc. I'd like to return the question to you because I think also people might be interested in hearing you about the two questions you've asked.
I think I think in what you're describing at the Weltkulturmuseum Museum Clémentine is I would like to know, I guess the way I look at it is how does the interaction with these objects, which at one point are sometimes considered the art kind of legacy of the world, and it's sometimes they're something that is unauthored, so kind of anathema to our idea of what art is, because art is in many ways the kind of exercise of authorship. How they pressure back or how they put pressure on our idea of art. You said two questions. I just asked you one. I'm trying to think of what other question I'm supposed to answer.
No, it was just a question of the link between the critical mode and art today. So that's the baseline of it. No? The first.
The Trojan horse.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm.
Greece.
Yeah, yes, I'm in a Greek frame of mind. I'm becoming increasingly uncomfortable with how artists are invited to solve institutional problems, to solve social problems, and at the same time increasingly interested in how effective that can be, I just spent the last 3 years on the south side of Chicago where the Astor Gates has bought a lot of property and is doing something that could be called a kind of gentrification, a kind of community building, a kind of neighborhood building, renovating space, acquiring collections, actually, and bringing, in the end of the day, bringing a lot of value to a neighborhood where the real estate prices were extremely low, because there was what one calls white flight from that neighborhood. Basically, during the Great Migration, a lot of most of the people who came from the south, fleeing segregation and looking for jobs, were kind of settled by the city into one region of Chicago, and all the white people left from the south side of Chicago. That created a crisis that's too complex, I think, to describe right at the moment, but suffice it to say maybe that it's been a place of great poverty in most parts of it. It's also where some of the wealthiest members of the black community, including the President of the United States, live. So I don't want to paint a total picture, a totalitarian picture of the poverty of the South Side, but it's a project that I'm seeing as something that's using the power of art to be the kind of to be something that governments cannot do, that institutions cannot do, like the University of Chicago. And it makes me curious. It doesn't make, I mean, I kind of wanted to open up this question, because it's a kind of, what I saw on the south side of Chicago was a kind of construction of something. And it's also very much predicated on a system of building belief. And criticality is not the thing on the table. You know what I mean? It's not. There is a kind of implicit criticality of the system that is being supplanted, but it is not a project that is busy trying to define what criticality is. There's a lot of performance involved, and a kind of suspension of that enlightenment question in order to make ground and create another set of possibilities. And I guess it made me think that somehow the crisis of criticality are its tools, are the fact that we have these discursive mechanisms for practicing it, but when it comes to other means, it's a little bit difficult. It's a little bit difficult to do it on a panel, of course, because we're meant to sit here and talk. But I just wanted to open up that idea that, you know, there is a kind of strange limit at the heart of the practice, in terms of what criticality sets out for itself as its kind of...
May I just kind of qualify the discussion of Theaster Gates? Because effectively Theaster was hugely supported by Dan Peterman, who set up the experimental station in this kind of weird zone between the south side and the north side of Chicago, where, not by chance, University of Chicago Press has its main HQ. Yeah? And I think that when you look back at Dan Peterman's work, which is really interesting, how he became big in the 90s with his skateboard ramps and his different projects, and then invested the money in the bike shop and everything, and the farmers market and what have you. And Theaster was part of that community. Yeah? What I'm sensing, and which I think is a polarization which isn't helpful in many ways, is a kind of okay, you can't prioritize a sort of art-making physical situation, and you can't be in it, actively within the situation, sitting in that Trojan horse, if you want to, yeah, if you also want to remain critical. And I think I don't want to work like that. I don't want to work with the passivity of being somebody who can write about other people's actions. And somebody like, you know, objects and people, they go in and out of power. Institutions go in and out of power, and suddenly, boom, they're back again. And for me, the question is, at the moment, how do we work with an architectonics of practice? How do we work ergonomically in an exhibition space? Exhibitions aren't just reifying, they're stultifying physically, yeah? So for me, though, taking on a museum, it begins with how do I prioritize how my body is going to action thoughts in the space which I've been given as a steward for the next 5 years. How do I deal with that? And there's some kind of sort of, well, on s'en fout. It's a kind of a laissez-faire attitude, a kind of mercantilism that would allow you to not even prioritize. You know, it's in a way, if you want to be strategic, you don't go to a place where the prioritization of a new architectonic isn't possible. Yeah, so a space like this is brilliant, works as it is. But if you go to an old villa like I've had to take over, and you look at it and you try and beat your head against the architecture that you've been provided with as a faute de mieux, then it won't work. So put beds in, create a third space. A third space meaning not just some kind of trendy term, but a space that is neither the exhibition nor the reserve. Yeah? Because what you have to imagine is that 5 million objects are behind lock and key. Yeah, that 20,000 euros a year goes out to kill the moths. And that you don't want to create miscegenation. Remember, everything isn't so far away. So if I want to put an object from the continent of Africa next to an object from Romania, next to an object from a work by Ante Majewski, next to a work by a fish trap that Dan Peterman selected, where do I do it? I can't do it straight in the exhibition, and I don't want to work with photographs. I refuse to allow the database to tell me how to deal with the sheer enormity of things, of objects and things and material culture. So I want to find unfinished situations, unfinished spaces, unfinished collections. And so my big question is there a specificity in the criticality that we're looking for? Or is it ubiquitous? Does it matter if you're doing something in Berlin, in Athens, in Gabon, yeah? Is there a specificity that we now, within art practice, should be fine-tuned to? Or do we just say the same thing everywhere? Yeah? And I'm curious about that. Specificity that would affect how we deal with time, how we deal with what an exhibition is, how we deal with teamwork. Contemporaneity only exists in a team. Otherwise, how do you want to know where you are, what time you're in, what space you're in? So what is the nature of the specificity of a teamwork in relation to something that would be restive, that would not allow you to sit on your laurels and just become a museum director?
But you're not seriously asking that question, right?
I want to know if there's a specificity.
I mean, for me, very quick. Yes, of course. I mean, any other answer seems to me rather absurd. But it is not easy to speak. It's not easy. It's not easy for us to enter into a meaningful dialogue with that specificity. This is what we have to solve. I mean, the kind of particular solutions that I tried to find for this recently is, for example, in China and Taiwan, it worked quite well by addressing a collective memory and all its kind of unspeakables by actually situating a contemporary art exhibition, which is totally part of a kind of blinding economy, within a literary tradition. And that made it speak to a specificity, and it does resonate. It's just about how you open and delineate and are navigating between the implicit and the explicit, explicit enough so to open it up as it speaks to that condition. It speaks to something that everybody there is part of, a historical experience that may not be yours, but that you can apprehend, because there is always a productive universality in our modes of communication, but there's also always unproductive universalities. And I think that's the very task, to engineer this, to engineer that relation.
But I think it's also interesting to work with material that is unclear, like this, that is not necessarily yet designated as art. Do you see what I mean? Or is not yet designated as an ethnographic object, or is not yet designated firmly. Because I think you've set up like a beautiful problem in the museum where this is starting to happen. But I'm wondering what kind of an impact it has on art. On the artists because what I saw, I guess what I was trying to explain with Chicago was this kind of weirdness of what Dan Peterman was doing and what Theaster were doing, that on one day it is an art project and it functions, but on another day it's a bike shop and it doesn't matter that it's art, and it's a real estate deal, or it's basically a candy shop or something like that, and it's that kind of a problematic that I think is very productive in terms of, we started out the discussion with the term, wait, I will get incongruity. So I just, yeah, I wanted to get back to incongruity and this kind of real need to confuse everybody, including ourselves.
There's one interesting thing about working in this. One particularly interesting thing is that you're constantly confronted with qualifications, classifications. So in 5 years, nearly 5 years of working with a laboratory, there's been a production of okay. I
meant to.
Well, I just finished the sentence. One of the most interesting things for me is to find a logic for the evaluation of the test works, of the unfinished works that have been produced by artists in the museum. Where do I gain the logic from? Is it that I go and look at what Antje Majewski is worth in her gallery in situ, Fabienne Leclerc? Do I go and look at what Thomas Bayerle is worth? Do I compare notes between different galleries in the market in order to qualify something, a new collection in a museum? And the hardest thing has been to figure out the logic. It's not like multiply 3 times what it costs to bring them over. What the residency cost financially just makes no sense at all. So there's something about working in this way with collections that are research collections that keeps them outside of a particular market. And therefore these questions, is it art, is it ethnography, they're also part of the market. They're also qualifiers. I mean, those kinds of questions. And I think, yeah, it's fertile ground, but I just didn't want to.
Let's open it up.
Well, I was looking at you. You should know Jean Lering from the former director of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. He's one of my great heroes in the little territory I come from, that of contemporary art. And he went from the Van Abbe Museum, he went to the Tropen Museum, which is the Dutch version of your museum, to there fail to do what he wanted to do. So I have a great respect for what you're doing. But at some points I was asking myself, here's people sitting on a platform of a specific area. And they do believe in art also, so how come that art plays such a small role in the discussion? And then I had to think of Niklas Luhmann, the old German systems theoretician, who distinguishes between self-referentiality of a field and what he calls alloreferentiality. And to my feeling, Weltkulturen is alloreferential, so it's like the world itself. But he says that the system, it works around what he calls, it becomes autopoetical because it focuses on a question. And if I remember right, his autopoetical, the kind of distinctive question for art is that it may make us think the world differently. And so then I understand that both of you go from the field of art into the field of world culture, because strangely enough it also has a capacity to make us think the possibility that the world can be thought differently also. But if both of them have the same question, then it's not the right question for art. So we might find another one. And when Anselm was mentioning first the kind of shrinking of the space, of the criteria, of the discussion about the criteria themselves for critique, and then the not growing of that space, and then of the shrinking of the space of alterity. I thought perhaps if we have to figure out, and that's really my question, a different question for art as a reference, perhaps it might be nearly the kind of Lacanian small a of absolute alterity, because somehow, like Monika said, you said in the sermon, you are the only one who sort of defined art as, to a large extent, the question of exertion of authorship. I mean, at least I think the question of art is the field on which podium you're sitting. It is traditionally, it has been formed by 19th century art historians, and not based on individuality necessarily, but on personality. So the kind of, is it possible to differentiate between the field you come from and the field you are now engaging for? And might it not be related to a kind of nearly a little a of the kind of belief in the capacity of personality, a strange perhaps fiction which may be shrinking, because perhaps we grow into a general world spirit.
But Bart, would you say personality, not individualism? I think there's like a specificity to what you're saying, but I don't understand what you mean by personality.
There's not to say individuality, which is non-linguistic term. Okay.
Actually, yes, we need to wrap it up for many reasons, because of Outso, because of our team, technical team, the entire team who was working here very hard for the last days. So, yeah, and it was. I think they need an applause first. Yeah, I will be more specific soon. And it's interesting. I learned, watching you from here, but also all the other panelists, I learned a lot about the politics of the crossed legs. There are always different directions, yeah. So, and it's very interesting. No. I have great photos of some panelists. Thank you to all of you. Those discussions will be continued soon. I have two new events to announce, which are opening soon. First, our new website. Next week. It should have opened already a couple of days ago, but now it opens on the 15th of April. And then the 16th of April, Destination Vienna. Very, very big show dedicated to Viennese artists or to artists who are referring to Vienna. Opening on the 16th, please come. This year will be the Life Center, the Performance Center. Vanessa John Müller, thank you very much. And we both thank first Juliane Bischoff. She had really the hardest job, I think, the last months in doing it, and Gerhard Brügger, of course. Martina Pieber, I don't know where she is our manager, Karlsplatz. Where is she? A little applause, please. The entire Hoyer team. Osmar El Tiep, I don't know where he is now. So, and all the panelists, our online audience, you and this fantastic last panel, and again, to be continued soon. It was great. I didn't want it to wrap up, but now we are really in time. We can have a drink. Thank you. So,